The Mediterranean waves crashed against the steel hull of the USS Massachusetts as Lieutenant Colonel William Henderson pressed his binoculars against the salt-stained glass of the transport ship's bridge. It was November 7th, 1942, and the largest amphibious operation in military history was about to unfold along the shores of French North Africa. Henderson could feel the tension radiating from every soldier packed into the vessel's hold, their faces painted with a mixture of determination and fear. "Zero our approaches, sir," whispered Sergeant Major Robert Clark, his voice barely audible above the rumble of the ship's engines. The darkness before dawn provided perfect cover for the massive Allied fleet of over 800 ships carrying more than 100,000 American and British troops toward three strategic targets: Casablanca in French Morocco, Oran and Algiers in French Algeria. General Dwight David Eisenhower had spent months planning this ambitious assault, codenamed Operation Torch. The operation represented America's first major offensive against Axis forces and would serve as a crucial stepping stone toward the eventual liberation of Europe. Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt had agreed that opening a second front in North Africa would relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, while simultaneously threatening German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps from behind. As documented in wartime correspondence between Allied commanders, the strategic importance of North Africa could not be overstated. Control of the Mediterranean shipping lanes and the Suez Canal hung in the balance, and success here would provide launching points for future operations against occupied Europe. Henderson watched as the first wave of landing craft began their descent from the transport ships. The young American soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, checked their equipment with nervous precision. Their M1 Garand rifles gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light, and their steel helmets bore fresh camouflage paint applied during the Atlantic crossing. Major General George Smith Patton Jr. commanded the Western Task Force approaching Casablanca, while Major General Lloyd Frednall led the Center Task Force toward Oran. The Eastern Task Force, under British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, aimed for Algiers. Each commander understood that the success of Operation Torch depended not only on military prowess, but also on the political complexities surrounding Vichy French forces defending the coastline. The Vichy French military, led by Admiral Jean-François Darlan, remained loyal to Marshal Philippe Pétain's collaborationist government. Intelligence reports suggested that French resistance might be minimal, but Henderson knew that soldiers rarely surrendered their posts without a fight. Regardless of political allegiances, the ship's public address system crackled to life as Captain James Morrison announced the final preparations. "Gentlemen, we stand at the threshold of history. Our mission is clear: establish a foothold in North Africa and begin the long march toward Berlin. Remember your training, trust your fellow soldiers, and may God watch over each of you." Henderson felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. His battalion would be among the first to hit the beaches near Casablanca, where heavily fortified French positions awaited their arrival. The success of democracy itself seemed to hang in the balance. As the first streaks of dawn painted the eastern horizon with bands of orange and gold, the landing craft engines roared as they cut through the churning surf toward the beaches of Fedala, just north of Casablanca. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson gripped his Thompson submachine gun tighter as spray from the Mediterranean soaked through his uniform. Around him, 36 soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division prepared for their first taste of combat on foreign soil. 2 minutes to touchdown, shouted the Navy coxswain over the mechanical symphony of dozens of landing craft approaching the shore simultaneously. Henderson could see the French coastal batteries positioned on the bluffs overlooking the beach, their long-barreled guns trained seaward like deadly fingers pointing toward the approaching invasion force. The first French shells began exploding in the water around 9:30 in the morning on November 8, 1942. Enormous geysers of seawater erupted between the landing craft as French artillery crews found their range. Henderson watched in horror as one landing craft to his left took a direct hit, disappearing in a ball of flame and smoke that left nothing but floating debris and oil slicks on the water's surface. "Keep your heads down and follow me when we hit the beach," Henderson yelled to his men as machine gun fire began chattering from French positions. The distinctive crack of German-supplied weapons, mixed with the deeper rumble of American naval gunfire as USS Augusta and USS Brooklyn began their bombardment of the shore installations. Private First Class Tommy Martinez from El Paso, Texas, vomited over the side of the landing craft as shrapnel from a near miss peppered the water around them. "I want to go home, sir," he whispered, his face pale as limestone beneath his helmet. "We're all scared, son," Henderson replied, placing a steady hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "But we have a job to do, and we're going to do it together." The landing craft's bow ramp dropped with a metallic clang as they reached the shallow water. 50 yards from shore, Henderson was the first man out, his boots splashing into the surface. Bullets whined overhead. The beach stretched before them like a killing field, with concrete obstacles and barbed wire creating a maze of defensive positions. Major General Patton had emphasized speed and aggression during their pre-invasion briefings. "We must establish our beachhead before the enemy can organize effective counterattacks," he had declared aboard the command ship. Every minute of hesitation cost American lives. Henderson's battalion advanced in short rushes across the sand, using natural cover and shell craters for protection. The French defenders fought with surprising tenacity despite intelligence reports suggesting they might surrender quickly. Vichy forces had been underestimated, and their German training showed in their disciplined defensive fire. Sergeant Clark appeared at Henderson's elbow, blood streaming from a superficial head wound. "Colonel, we've got casualties mounting fast. The medics are overwhelmed, and we need to silence that machine gun nest on the right flank." The battle for the beaches had become a brutal test of American resolve. Young soldiers who had trained in the safety of camps in Georgia and North Carolina now faced the reality of modern warfare. The smell of curdite and blood mixed with the salt air as the 1st Infantry Division clawed its way inland against determined resistance. By noon, Henderson's battalion had advanced 300 yards from the waterline, but at a terrible cost. 18 soldiers lay dead on the sand behind them, and twice that number bore wounds that would send them to field hospitals. The price of democracy was being paid in American blood on the shores of North Africa. The ancient city of Casablanca rose from the coastal plain like a medieval fortress, its whitewashed buildings gleaming in the afternoon sun of November 8, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson crouched behind a low stone wall with his surviving men, studying the French positions through his field glasses. Modern port facilities and airfields surrounding the city represented crucial objectives. For the Western Task Force's success, Admiral François Mislier commanded the French naval forces defending Casablanca, and his sailors had proven themselves formidable opponents. The French battleship Jean Bart, though incomplete and moored permanently in the harbor, continued to fire its massive 15-inch guns at American ships offshore. Each thunderous salvo sent tremors through the ground, where Henderson's battalion had established their temporary position. "Sir, we've received orders to advance on the Medina airfield," reported Captain David Reynolds, Henderson's executive officer. Fresh blood stained his field jacket from treating wounded soldiers throughout the morning assault. Intelligence indicates the French have approximately 20 WWII D-520 fighters operational, and they must be neutralized before they can coordinate with Rommel's Luftwaffe units. The strategic importance of capturing intact airfields had been emphasized repeatedly during pre-invasion planning sessions. Without air superiority, the Allied forces would remain vulnerable to German counterattacks from Tunisia and Libya. Field Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps, though currently engaged with British forces near El Alamein, possessed the mobility to redirect substantial forces toward the new American threat. Henderson's battalion began their advance toward Medina at 1400 hours, moving through olive groves and small farming villages. Where French colonial administrators had fled at the first sound of gunfire, the local Arab population watched the American soldiers with curious detachment, uncertain whether these foreign invaders represented liberation or merely another form of occupation. Private Martinez, who had overcome his initial terror during the beach assault, now moved with the careful precision of a combat veteran despite having been under fire. "For less than 6 hours, Colonel, I could see French positions around the airfield perimeter. Looks like they've got at least 2 companies dug in with machine guns and mortars." The tactical situation required careful coordination between American ground forces and naval gunfire support. USS Massachusetts maintained radio contact with Henderson's forward observers, ready to provide accurate artillery support when requested. The massive battleship's 16-inch guns could deliver devastating firepower, but only if American troops could provide precise target coordinates without endangering themselves. French resistance stiffened as American forces approached the strategic airfield. Colonel Charles Nogues, the resident general of French Morocco, had issued orders for his troops to resist the Allied invasion with all available means. The complex political situation created by Vichy France's collaboration with Nazi Germany meant that French soldiers found themselves fighting against former allies while defending territory from what they perceived as foreign aggression. The afternoon battle for Medina airfield became a grinding infantry engagement. characterized by short rushes between covered positions and methodical reduction of French strong points. Henderson's men had learned quickly from their morning experiences, using suppressive fire and coordinated movement to minimize casualties while maintaining offensive momentum. By 1600 hours, the American flag flew over the control tower at Midway airfield. French resistance had collapsed after their commanding officer, Major Paul Bertrand, was wounded by shrapnel from a naval artillery round. The surviving French defenders, many of whom were young conscripts from metropolitan France, surrendered with visible relief after hours of intense combat. Henderson surveyed the captured airfield with grim satisfaction. 19 French aircraft lay destroyed or damaged on the tarmac, eliminating a significant threat to Allied shipping offshore. However, the cost had been substantial. His battalion had suffered 37 casualties during the assault, reducing his effective strength by nearly 15% in a single afternoon of combat. 300 miles to the east, the ancient Casbah of Algiers echoed with the sounds of urban warfare as British and American forces fought their way through narrow streets toward the city center. Major Robert Sterling of the British First Army pressed himself against a bullet-scarred wall, listening to the distinctive chatter of German Schmeisser submachine guns from the building. Across the plaza, the Eastern Task Force had achieved initial success in their amphibious assault near Algiers, but French resistance had proven more organized and determined than intelligence estimates had predicted. Admiral Darlan's forces controlled key government buildings and communication centers, making coordination between Allied units increasingly difficult as the day progressed. Major Sterling, "We have reports that French colonial troops are advancing on our left flank," whispered Corporal James McPherson, his Scottish accent thick with exhaustion and combat stress. He young soldier's uniform bore the stains of a full day's fighting through the maze-like streets of North Africa's most important port city. Lieutenant General Anderson had established his command post in a captured French customs house near the harbor, where constant radio traffic provided upgrades on the complex three-pronged assault. Messages from Casablanca indicated that Patton's forces were making steady progress despite heavy casualties, while reports from Oran suggested that Fredinal's Center Task Force faced the stiffest resistance of all three landing zones. The political complications surrounding Operation Torch had become increasingly apparent. As the day wore on, General Henry Giraud, whom Allied intelligence had hoped would rally French forces to their cause, remained under virtual house arrest by Vichy authorities without unified French leadership. Willing to cooperate with the invasion, every strong point had to be taken by force. Sterling's company had been tasked with securing the central post office and telegraph exchange, critical installations for controlling communications throughout French Algeria. The two-story stone building had been fortified by French engineers, with machine gun positions covering all approaches and careful fields of fire established to channel attacking forces into killing zones. "We'll need concentrated mortar fire on the second-floor windows," Sterling decided, studying the target through his binoculars. "Then we advance into teams. McPherson takes half the men around the left side, while I lead the frontal assault. Timing will be everything." The assault on the telegraph exchange began at 1700 hours with a coordinated barrage from 3-inch mortars positioned on nearby rooftops. The French defenders responded with accurate rifle fire and hand grenades thrown from upper-story windows. Erling's men advanced by rushes, using doorways and market stalls for cover while maintaining suppressive fire against French positions. "Keep going, Major," he shouted through gritted teeth. "Don't let the bastards pin you down." The urban warfare skills that British forces had developed during the London Blitz proved invaluable in the confined spaces of the Algiers Casbah. Sterling's men moved with practiced efficiency, clearing buildings room by room while maintaining communication through hand signals and whispered commands. By 1800 hours, the Union Jack flew over the central telegraph exchange. French resistance in this sector had been broken, though isolated sniper fire continued from the surrounding buildings. Sterling's company had achieved its objective, but at a cost of 11 casualties among 43 men engaged. The capture of Algiers represented a crucial victory for the Eastern Task Force. The city's modern port facilities would serve as a vital supply base for future operations, while its airfields provided platforms for fighter aircraft that could contest German air superiority over the Mediterranean. The port city of Oran presented the most formidable challenge for Allied forces during Operation Torch. Major General Lloyd Fredinal's Center Task Force faced heavily fortified positions, defended by veteran French colonial troops who had spent years preparing defensive positions. Throughout the surrounding hills, Colonel James Roosevelt, son of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, commanded one of the assault battalions tasked with capturing the strategic port facilities. The younger Roosevelt had insisted on serving in a combat role despite his father's concerns, and now found himself leading American soldiers against French positions overlooking Oran's Harbor. "The French have turned every building into a fortress," reported Captain Michael O'Sullivan as explosions echoed across the city. Below their observation post, they're using the old Foreign Legion barracks as their main command center, and it's built like a medieval castle. The 2nd Battalion of the 16th Infantry Regiment had been fighting continuously since their pre-dawn landing at Arzu, a small port town east of Oran. French resistance had been immediate and intense, with coastal artillery batteries engaging American landing craft while they were still offshore. The USS Ranger had provided crucial air support, but French anti-aircraft guns had shot down 6 American aircraft during the initial assault phase. Colonel Roosevelt studied the tactical situation through his field glasses, noting the excellent fields of fire that French engineers had established to defend the approaches to Oran. The enemy positions were mutually supporting, with machine gun nests positioned to provide crossfire against any attacking force. Tank traps and barbed wire obstacles further complicated the tactical problem facing American commanders. "We need to coordinate with the Navy for gunfire support," Roosevelt decided. "Those French positions on Hill 214 are holding up our entire advance. Without naval artillery, we'll take prohibitive casualties trying to root them out with infantry alone." The USS Philadelphia maintained station offshore, her 8-inch guns ready to provide accurate fire support to American forces ashore. However, the proximity of French and American positions in the urban environment made naval gunfire extremely dangerous for friendly forces. Forward observers had to provide precise target coordinates to prevent tragic mistakes. At 1500 hours on November 8th, Roosevelt's battalion began their assault on the French Foreign Legion barracks. The attack commenced with a concentrated artillery barrage from the Philadelphia, followed by coordinated infantry advances from 3 directions. American soldiers moved in small groups, using fire and movement tactics to close with French positions. The French defenders fought with the professional competence of experienced colonial troops. Many had served in Syria and Indochina, where they had learned the brutal realities of modern warfare. Their machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, and their mortars had been pre-registered on likely American approach routes. Sergeant First Class Antonio Valdez from New Mexico distinguished himself during the assault by single-handedly silencing a French machine gun position that had pinned down an entire American platoon. Armed only with grenades and a Thompson submachine gun, Valdez crawled through enemy fire to within 20 yards of the position. Before launching his attack, "For America," Valdez shouted as he charged the French position, his battle cry echoing off the stone walls of the barracks courtyard. His sacrifice allowed Roosevelt's main assault force to breach the outer defenses and establish a foothold inside the fortress-like structure. The battle for the Foreign Legion barracks continued until nightfall, with fighting moving from room to room and floor to floor. American soldiers faced French defenders who knew every corridor and defensive position in the complex. Hand grenades exploded constantly as both sides attempted to dislodge their opponents from prepared positions. By 2100 hours, American forces controlled the main barracks building, but scattered French resistance continued throughout the night. Roosevelt's battalion had suffered 40 casualties during the assault, including Sergeant Valdez, who was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroic actions. As darkness fell over North Africa on November 8, 1942, the 3 prongs of Operation Torch had established precarious footholds along the coast, but the political situation remained dangerously fluid. In Gibraltar, General Eisenhower paced the floor of his underground command bunker, studying radio reports from the 3 task forces and weighing the complex diplomatic factors that could determine the operation's ultimate success or failure. Admiral Darlan's presence in Algiers had created an unexpected opportunity for Allied negotiators. The French admiral commanded significant influence over Vichy forces throughout North Africa, and his cooperation could potentially end organized French resistance within hours. However, dealing with a prominent collaborator posed serious political risks for both Roosevelt and Churchill. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson's battalion had established defensive positions around the captured Mediuna airfield near Casablanca, but intelligence reports indicated that German forces in Tunisia were already preparing counterattacks against the new Allied presence in North Africa. Field Marshal Rommel's Afrika Korps possessed the experience, and equipment necessary to launch devastating attacks against American forces, who were still learning the harsh realities of desert warfare. "Sir, we have confirmation that French naval forces are preparing to sortie from Casablanca Harbor," reported Henderson's communications officer. "The battleship Jean Bart has been firing intermittently at our ships all day, and now it appears that Admiral Michelier is planning to attack our transports with his remaining cruisers and destroyers." The naval battle that erupted in Casablanca Harbor during the early morning hours of November 9th would prove decisive for the Western Task Force's continued operations. USS Massachusetts engaged Jean Bart in a classic battleship duel, while American cruisers and destroyers fought desperate actions against French ships attempting to reach the vulnerable transport vessels. Captain Robert McKinley, commanding the destroyer USS Cole, found his ship caught between the French cruisers as they attempted their breakout from the harbor. All ahead flank, he ordered as enemy shells bracketed his vessel. "Prepare for torpedo attack on the leading cruiser." The destroyer's 5-inch guns blazed continuously as the Cole maneuvered to avoid French fire, while closing the torpedo range. McKinley's crew had trained extensively for night surface actions, but the reality of combat against professional opponents tested every skill they had learned. During peacetime exercises, French gunfire accuracy surprised American commanders, who had expected colonial forces to lack modern training and equipment. The cruiser Primiguet fought with particular distinction, engaging multiple American vessels simultaneously while attempting to protect French merchant ships fleeing the harbor. "They're fighting like the old French Navy," observed Rear Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt from his flagship Augusta. "These aren't colonial troops, they're professional sailors defending their homeland." The complexity of the North African campaign became increasingly apparent as reports arrived from all three landing zones. In Iran, Colonel Roosevelt's forces had captured key objectives, but faced continued resistance from French troops who showed no signs of surrendering. Near Algiers, British forces had secured the port facilities, but discovered extensive demolition damage that would limit their operational capacity for weeks. General Eisenhower faced the crucial decision of whether to authorize negotiations with Admiral Darlan despite the political controversy such talks would inevitably create. The immediate military situation demanded rapid resolution of French resistance, so that Allied forces could concentrate on the growing German threat from Tunisia. General Clark will conduct preliminary discussions with Admiral Darlan. Eisenhower decided after consulting with his staff officers, "We must determine whether French cooperation is possible, while maintaining our strategic flexibility." The fate of Operation Torch hung in the balance as November 9th dawned over North Africa. American forces had demonstrated their ability to conduct complex amphibious operations, but the real test would come when German reinforcements arrived to challenge their tenuous footholds along the Mediterranean coast. Dawn on November 11, 1942, revealed the true cost of Operation Torch's initial success. American cemeteries had appeared overnight near all three landing zones, marked by temporary wooden crosses bearing the names of soldiers who would never see home again. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson stood silently among the graves at Fedallah, reading names of men he had commanded for 2 years of training in the United States. The armistice agreement signed by Admiral Darlan had finally ended organized French resistance throughout North Africa, but the 3-day battle had exacted a heavy toll on Allied forces. More than 1,500 American and British soldiers lay dead or wounded, while French casualties exceeded 1,000 military personnel and an unknown number of civilians. Caught in the crossfire of urban combat, Private First Class Martinez approached Henderson's position carrying a field telephone. "Sir, General Patton wants to speak with all battalion commanders immediately. Something about German reinforcements landing in Tunisia." The strategic situation had shifted dramatically during the 3 days of fighting along the North African coast. While Allied forces established their beachheads and negotiated French surrender, German high command had reacted with characteristic speed and efficiency. Transport aircraft were already delivering Wehrmacht reinforcements to Tunis and Bizerte, creating a new front that would challenge Allied plans for rapid expansion eastward. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, had recognized immediately that North Africa represented a crucial theater that could determine the outcome of the entire war. "We must hold Tunisia at all costs," he had declared during emergency planning sessions in Rome. "The Americans have opened a second front, but they are inexperienced and vulnerable to determined counterattack." Colonel Roosevelt's battalion in Iran faced the immediate challenge of integrating former French colonial troops who had agreed to join the Allied cause following Darlin's Armistice Order. Many French soldiers possess valuable combat experience and intimate knowledge of North African terrain, but their loyalty remained questionable after years of Vichy indoctrination. We must treat them as allies while remaining vigilant for potential betrayal, Roosevelt advised his company commanders during their morning briefing. Remember that just 3 days ago, these same men were shooting at us. Political agreements don't instantly change personal loyalties. The logistical challenges of sustaining Allied forces in North Africa were becoming apparent as supply ships began unloading equipment and reinforcements at the captured ports. Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers possessed modern facilities, but German submarine attacks in the Atlantic threatened the steady flow of supplies necessary for major military operations. Major Sterling's company in Algiers had been tasked with establishing communication links between the three Allied lodgements, but German air attacks were increasing in frequency and accuracy. Luftwaffe bombers operating from Sicily and Sardinia could reach North African targets, creating constant threats to Allied shipping and ground installations. Intelligence reports indicate that Rommel is withdrawing forces from the El Alamein front, Sterling reported to his superiors. If he can establish a defensive line in Tunisia before we can advance eastward, we'll face months of additional fighting in difficult terrain. The human cost of Operation Torch extended beyond military casualties to include thousands of French civilians displaced by the fighting. In Casablanca's native quarters, entire families had fled their homes during the bombardment, creating refugee problems that strained Allied resources and complicated relations with the local population. Henderson's battalion received orders to advance inland toward the Atlas Mountains, where German reconnaissance units were reportedly establishing observation posts to monitor Allied movements. The next phase of the North African campaign would test American soldiers against Wehrmacht veterans, who had proven their combat effectiveness in Poland, France, and Russia. Gentlemen, Operation Torch has succeeded in its primary objective, General Eisenhower announced during his first press conference following the armistice. Allied forces now control strategic bases in North Africa, from which we can launch future operations against Axis forces throughout the Mediterranean region. The victory, however, represented only the beginning of what would become a grinding campaign lasting 18 months. American forces had demonstrated their ability to project power across the Atlantic and conduct successful amphibious operations, but the Wehrmacht's rapid response in Tunisia ensured that the battle for North Africa was far from over. As Henderson's men prepared for their advance into the Atlas Mountains, the young lieutenant colonel reflected on the transformation of his soldiers. During their first 3 days of combat, boys from farms and factories across America had become veterans, tempered by fire and loss, but strengthened by the knowledge that they could stand against professional opponents and prevail. The price of victory in Operation Torch had been paid in American blood on foreign soil, but that sacrifice had opened the door to eventual Allied triumph in World War II. The road to Berlin would be long and costly, but it began on the beaches of North Africa in November 1942, when ordinary Americans proved they could fight and win against fascist tyranny. Reference: historical details regarding Operation Torch operations and casualty figures have been compiled from official U.S. Army historical records and wartime correspondence archived at the National Archives. As documented in the U.S. Army in World War II, the War in the Mediterranean series,